The wind came at them sideways across the frozen prairie, carrying the smell of snow and something darker desperation maybe, or the faint metallic tang of blood on frozen ground. December 1883, in the American West, meant survival was measured in heartbeats and the distance between warmth and death. A stagecoach sat mired in black mud, 30 miles from Silver Spur, its wheels sunk so deep, the horses strained and steamed their breath, rising in ragged white clouds that the wind tore apart before they could fully form. Fitzgerald Crowell stepped down first, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He was a man accustomed to ownership of land of cattle of water rights secured through barbed wire fences patented by Glidden back in 1874 of people, when the law allowed it, and sometimes when it did not. His wool overcoat was cut from Eastern fabric, expensive and clean, despite the journey, and his beard was trimmed in the style of businessmen who conducted transactions in leather chairs rather than on horseback. Between Crowell and the Lakota warrior stood a woman, and it was in her eyes that the true story began. Arabella Ward was 24 years old, though the journey had aged her. Her feet were bare despite the December cold, the shoes lost somewhere between Chicago and this godforsaken stretch of territory. Her dress, once a respectable traveling costume in dark blue wool, hung torn at the hem, stained with mud and fear sweat. She clutched a scuffed leather valise to her chest, as if it were the last piece of dignity she possessed. Inside were letters, her letters returned undeliverable, and a tintype of a man she had never met but had trusted anyway. Thomas Reed. Dead 3 weeks now in a mine blast, though no one had bothered to tell her until it was too late to turn back. Her hands shook, and not from cold. The shaking came from somewhere deeper, from the realization that she had traveled 2,000 miles on promises written in careful handwriting, only to discover that promises dissolved like snow in spring rain. That she had become, in the eyes of territorial law and Fitzgerald Crowell's forged documents, property. Toddy stood between them now, and Arabella felt something loosen in her chest, not relief, not yet, but the first breath after drowning. Toddy was Oglala Lakota, about 30 winters by his people's reckoning, lean and hard in the way of men who lived by skill rather than comfort. His buckskin coat bore the stains of long wear, fringed at the sleeves, in the old way his grandmother had taught him before the wars. A scar ran along his left ribs, a thick white line where barbed wire had torn him open last summer. Not any barbed wire, but Crowell's illegal fence stretched across White Fork River in direct violation of the Homestead Act of 1862. Toddy remembered that day with perfect clarity. He had been guiding his widowed aunt Ehawi and her 3 children to their allotment land when they came across Crowell's fence blocking the river. The children were thirsty, the horses needed water, and the law said that water belonged to everyone. So Toddy had cut the wire. Crowell's men, 5 of them, all armed, had come riding hard. They had beaten him while his aunt screamed and the children cried. In the struggle, someone had shoved him into a tangle of loose barbed wire. The barbs had torn through his buckskin shirt and opened his side like a gutted fish. The men had laughed as they rode away, and Toddy had walked 3 miles to the nearest homestead, leaving a trail of blood in the prairie grass before a woman stitched him closed with thread meant for mending quilts. His aunt Ehawi had been so frightened she had taken her children back to the reservation rather than risk another encounter. Toddy had never forgiven himself for that, and he had certainly never forgiven Crowell. Now he stood perfectly still, weight-centered left hand loose at his side, right hand near the bone-handled knife on his belt. His eyes tracked Crowell the way a hunter tracks a wolf that has learned to kill livestock. Crowell spoke first. "She's paid for. The marriage is legal under territorial statute. Proxy contracts are recognized from here to California." Toddy's voice was quieter, but it cut through the wind like a blade through canvas. "You don't own her." Arabella felt the words reach her, felt them settle into her bones like warmth after cold. She wet her cracked lips and lifted her chin. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out anyway. My name is Arabella Ward. I never agreed to be anyone's property. The wind slashed across standing water, trapped in a wagon ruts, sending ripples through the black ice, forming at the edges. Somewhere distant, a cattle pond cracked with a rifle shot crack. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension. Crowell's two drovers climbed down from the driver's bench, hands drifting toward the Colt revolvers holstered at their hips. Weapons that dated back to the 1850s, heavy and reliable, perfectly capable of killing at 20 paces. Crowell reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded document. Heavy paper and embossed seal visible even from a distance. I have the papers right here. Proxy marriage signed by Thomas Reed before his passing, yet no law allowed any transfer of a wife. The paper was void, all legal under territorial statute. Miss Ward here is understandably confused given the circumstances. But once we return to my ranch, we can sort out any misunderstandings. No, Arabella said, surprising herself with the force of the word. Crowell's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, annoyance, calculation. Toddy turned slightly and spoke to Arabella, his voice low. Do you choose this man? She shook her head. No, I do not. Toddy stepped forward, placing his body between her and Crowell. Then she goes free. The tall drover with the scarred nose let his hand rest fully on his pistol grip. You need to step aside, Chief. Toddy heard the faint click of a hammer being thumbed back, metal sliding over metal. He spoke without raising his voice. You fire, and when the sound reaches town, every ear will know you shot at a man standing between you and a woman you claimed as your lawful wife. How will that look in Judge Morrison's courtroom? The drover froze. Crowell's jaw tightened. Arabella stepped forward, her bare feet pressing against frozen mud. Whatever papers you have, I never signed them. Thomas Reed and I corresponded for 6 months. Yes, I agreed to come west and marry him. But Thomas Reed is dead, and I never agreed to be transferred to you or anyone else like livestock. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind and the creak of leather as the horses shifted. Then Crowell smiled, cold and thin. Well, I can see there's been considerable confusion. We'll take this matter to town. Let Sheriff Pike explain the finer points of territorial marriage law to Miss Ward. He looked directly at Toddy. You're welcome to accompany us. In fact, I insist. Toddy met Arabella's eyes. The question was silent but clear, trust me. She held his gaze, searching his face, then nodded slowly. Yes. Bring your papers, Toddy said to Crowell. We will see what the law says. Crowell's smile widened. He gestured toward the stagecoach. After you, Miss Ward. They had been traveling for 2 hours through deepening darkness when the stagecoach finally rattled into Silver Spur. The town appeared from the night, like a promise half-kept 2 streets crossing at a central square. Wooden buildings sagging under the weight of too many hard winters, lamplight spilling yellow from windows. The town had been thrown together during the mining boom 5 years earlier, and it showed in every crooked angle and gap-toothed roofline. Sheriff Orville Pike was waiting on the walkway outside his office. He was a big man north of 40, with a belly that strained his vest buttons and a thick mustache. He wore his badge pinned prominently and carried a double-barrel shotgun in the crook of his arm. His eyes, pale blue and tired, took in the scene. Crowell relaxed. Toddy, tense. Arabella barefoot and shivering. Evening fits. Orville said, his voice deep and slow with a Kentucky drawl. Sam sent word ahead. Said you had some kind of dispute needs settling. Crowell handed over the document. No dispute, Orville. Just a legal matter requiring clarification. This young woman is my wife, by proxy marriage legally contracted to Thomas Reed before his death, with all rights transferred to me as executor of Reed's estate. She's been confused by this man, and I'd appreciate you explaining territorial marriage law so we can all move forward. Orville unfolded the papers slowly. He was not a fast reader, but he was thorough. His eyes moved across the lines of text, taking in the signatures, the notary seal, the dense legal language. Arabella watched him read and felt her hope bleeding away. The document looked official. It probably was official in the technical sense. "This looks legal enough," Orville said finally, his tone carefully neutral. The words hit her like a fist. She made a sound, half sob, half gasp, and stumbled forward. "I never signed it. I never agreed to any of this. Yes, I corresponded with Thomas Reed. Yes, I agreed to come west and marry him. But I didn't know he was dead. No one told me. And I certainly never agreed to be handed off to someone else like furniture." Her voice cracked and she stopped breathing hard. Crowell sighed. She's understandably upset. The journey has been exceptionally hard on her. Once she's had an opportunity to rest, I'm quite certain she'll come to understand the situation. Arabella fumbled with her valise, trying to pull out her own letters, but her fingers were numb, and one of the letters slipped and fell into the mud. "Kinyon," Toddy said quietly in Lakota. He stepped closer and placed his palm gently on her valise. "Wait, not yet." She looked up at him, tears stinging her eyes. "But I have to prove—" "Not yet," he repeated. "Trust me." She swallowed hard and closed the valise. A voice cut through the night air, sharp and furious. "Care for her the way you cared for Cora Bennett." Mabel Dwyer stepped out of the shadows, a lantern in one hand, and fury etched into every line of her face. She was about 35, a schoolteacher with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Behind her came a small cluster of townspeople. Among them were several women, the blacksmith's wife, a widow, who ran the boarding house, 2 younger seamstresses, and Foxy Kate, the woman who ran card games at the Purple Sage Saloon. Mabel walked forward with purpose. "Last year, Fitzgerald Crowell, you brought in another young woman, Cora Bennett. Sweet girl, only 19, came out from Pennsylvania on a marriage contract like this one. Except the man she was supposed to marry never existed. And when Cora arrived stranded with no money, you offered her employment working upstairs at the Purple Sage, trying to pay off a travel debt that kept growing. She died 6 months later. You said it was fever." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Arabella saw expressions ranging from shock to knowing resignation. Foxy Kate stepped forward. "I kept the books, Orville. I know what Cora owed and what she paid. The numbers never added up right. Interest kept getting tacked on. That girl worked herself into the ground and died owing more than when she started." Crowell's expression hardened. "That is slander, Mabel. And you, Kate, you're biting the hand that feeds you. Both of you be very careful." "It's not slander if it's true," Mabel shot back. "And I'll say it under oath before Judge Morrison when he returns from Prairie Rose." The women behind Mabel murmured agreement. Crowell's voice dropped dangerously. "Remove her, Orville. Now." But Orville did not move immediately. He stood holding the papers, his face troubled. He looked at Mabel, then at the gathered women, then at Arabella. Behind his eyes, calculation was happening, family loyalty versus something else. His wife Sarah was Crowell's youngest sister. She had given Orville 3 children and 15 years of companionship. But Sarah had also wept when Cora Bennett died, had whispered to Orville in their bed that something was wrong, that her brother had changed. Orville had dismissed her concerns then, but the memory of those tears haunted him now. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Miss Ward can stay at Doc Boone's place tonight. Neutral ground. Tomorrow we'll sort this out proper-like. Judge Morrison won't be back from Prairie Rose for at least a week, and I'm not making permanent decisions until he's reviewed these papers. Crowell's face darkened. She's my wife, Orville. My legal wife. Maybe she is, and maybe she isn't, Orville said, steel in his voice now. But until the circuit judge says so, official-like Miss Ward stays at Doc Boone's. That's how it's going to be, Fitz. Don't push me on this. The two men stared at each other. After a long, tense moment, Crowell stepped back and nodded curtly. Fine. One night at Doc's. But I want your word, Orville, your word as sheriff and as family, that she doesn't leave town. Not one step outside town limits. You have it. Crowell turned and walked toward the saloon, his drovers following. He did not look back, but his silence carried threat. Orville gestured with the shotgun toward a small building at the far end of the street. Doc Boone's that way. He'll give you a cot and something warm. As they walked through the muddy street, Arabella limping, Toddy staying close, she became aware of eyes watching. Some held sympathy, others suspicion, some careful neutrality. But she also noticed several of the women who had stood with Mabel following at a discreet distance. Their presence felt like protection. Arabella stumbled, and before she could catch herself, Toddy moved closer. Without a word, he slipped his heavy bison hide coat from his shoulders and draped it over her. The coat was warm from his body heat and smelled of wood smoke and leather. She looked up at him, surprised. Their eyes met, and she saw in his face not pity, but recognition, as if he understood exactly what it meant to be treated as less than human. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, saying nothing, but the gesture had shifted something between them. A fragile thread of connection formed in the darkness. Dr. Silas Boone lived above his medical practice in rooms that smelled of carbolic acid and dried herbs. He was about 50, with gray hair and hands that shook slightly from arthritis, but could still set a bone true. When Orville brought Arabella and Toddy to his door, Silas took one look at the barefoot woman and stepped aside without needing explanation. "Back room's got a cot. I'll heat up some broth." Arabella sank onto a wooden chair, and Silas knelt to examine her feet. Blisters cut the beginning of frostbite on 2 toes. He worked in silence, cleaning the wounds with warm water and carbolic acid, then wrapping them in strips of clean cotton. Toddy positioned himself by the window where he could see the street below. From here, he had a clear view of the Purple Sage Saloon and the sheriff's office. Crowell's men had gathered outside the saloon, smoking and glancing toward Doc Boone's place every few minutes. Arabella hissed as Silas touched a deep cut. Without thinking, Toddy crossed the room and placed his hand on her elbow, steadying her. His touch was light but firm, lingering a moment longer than necessary. "You will be all right," he said quietly, then added in Lakota, "Wastelakapi." She did not understand the words, but something in his tone conveyed the meaning. She nodded, and some of the tension in her shoulders eased. Silas finished and handed her a cup of beef broth hot enough to burn. She drank it anyway, desperate for warmth. A knock at the door made everyone tense. Silas opened it to reveal Mabel carrying a bundle of papers. Behind her stood Klaus Bittner, the telegraph clerk. Klaus was thin and nervous, about 40, with ink-stained fingers that never stopped moving and eyes that would not stay still. He worked in the small telegraph office next to the train depot, a job that paid $20 a month and required him to send messages without asking questions. He stepped inside like a man entering a confessional, glancing over his shoulder constantly. "Klaus has something you need to see," Mabel said. Klaus pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket with shaking hands. It was a carbon copy from his telegraph ledger. "I made a copy of the message Crowell's foreman sent 2 weeks ago." He handed it to Toddy. Toddy read aloud, "Deliver Arabella to Fitz Crowell. Stop proxy marriage arranged per contract. Stop fee cleared. Stop signed. Bruno Capel end." Arabella set down her cup, her face pale. "Who is Bruno Capel?" "Crowell's foreman," Mabel said. "Prussian immigrant. Used to work for the Union Pacific before the railroad let him go for being too rough with Chinese laborers. He's been with Crowell 3 years. Mean as a snake." Klaus shifted nervously. "I didn't understand what it meant at the time. Crowell pays me $5 extra every month to send certain messages without recording them officially, no questions asked. $5 is a lot of money. My wife's been sick and the medicine costs." He stopped, shook his head. "That's no excuse. After Mabel told me about Cora, about the other women." His voice dropped. "I think he's been doing this for years. Bringing women out on fake contracts, then forcing them to work off imaginary debts in saloons or worse." Toddy studied Klaus. "Why are you telling us now?" Klaus's face went pale. "Because if this goes to trial, I'm implicated. I sent those messages. I took Crowell's money. A prosecutor could argue I was part of the conspiracy, and they'd hang me alongside Crowell. Or maybe Crowell decides he doesn't want me testifying, and I end up in a ditch with a bullet in my head. Either way, I'm a dead man, unless Crowell goes down first. Figured I might as well try to do one decent thing before I meet my maker." Arabella stood awkwardly. "We need to take this to the sheriff." "Orville won't act without Judge Morrison," Mabel said. "The judge won't be back for a week. Crowell can wait you out. He owns half this town." "Then we leave," Arabella said desperately. "Tonight." "Orville gave his word you'd stay," Toddy said gently. "If we break that, he'll be forced to form a legal posse. And Crowell's men are watching." "So what do we do?" Toddy looked out at the gathering darkness, at the snow beginning to fall. "We wait, and we watch for an opening. Confident men make mistakes." Klaus spoke up hesitantly. "There's something else. 2 days ago, I heard Bruno and one of Crowell's ranch hands talking at the telegraph office. They didn't know I could hear through the wall. Bruno was saying something about a line camp near White Fork River, about 2 miles northeast of town. He said they had a shipment coming through, needed to be held there until the arrangements were finalized." He looked at Arabella. "I think there might be other women. Women like you being held until Crowell can move them." The room went very quiet. "If there are women being held," Toddy said grimly, "we need to know where and how many. This could be the evidence we need to destroy Crowell's operation completely." But waiting proved harder than fighting. As the night deepened, Silas lit more lanterns and brought out blankets. Mabel refused to leave settling near the door. Klaus left after an hour, too frightened to stay, but promising to watch for any relevant messages. Toddy remained by the window, never straying far from his knife. Arabella tried to rest, but sleep would not come. Her mind churned relentlessly. Around midnight, she gave up and came to stand beside Toddy at the window. She had wrapped herself in one of Silas's blankets, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. They stood in silence, watching the snow fall. Then Arabella spoke barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You owe me nothing." Toddy did not answer immediately. He thought about the wars, about treaties broken about his Aunt Ahawi, driven back to the reservation by fear about the scar on his ribs. He thought about Cora Bennett, dead at 19. "Because no one should own another person," he said finally. He turned to look at her. "In my language, we say, Iyuha wichasha ikche wichasha. All men are equal, all people. This is not words. This is truth that must be defended, or it becomes empty lies. Arabella felt something in her chest tighten and release. I don't speak your language, but I understand. She reached out tentatively and placed her hand on his arm. Just a light touch, barely contact at all. In Chicago, before I left my sister, Eleanor told me I should be grateful that any man was willing to marry me. That I was 24 and plain and poor and had no prospects. She said beggars can't be choosers, and I was definitely a beggar. Her voice caught. I think part of me believed her. But you're treating me like I matter, like my choices matter. No one's done that in a very long time. Toddy looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Your sister was wrong. You are not plain. Your face has character and intelligence and courage. These things are beautiful. And no one, no matter what they look like or how much money they have, deserves to be treated as property. That is the truth. Arabella's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. You barely know me. I have eyes, he said simply. And I listen when people speak. You are brave. You spoke up against Crowell even when you were terrified. You are intelligent. You understood the contract was a trap. You are kind. You worry about other women who might be suffering even while you are in danger. These are the things that matter. Before Arabella could respond, a shout erupted from the street. Both turned to the window to see orange flames rising from the telegraph office, casting wild shadows. Smoke billowed black against the night sky. By thunder, Silas breathed. The telegraph office is on fire. Toddy's jaw tightened. They are destroying the records. Klaus's carbon copies the message logs, anything that could be evidence. Then we need to go, Arabella said, sudden clarity cutting through exhaustion. Right now, while they're distracted, this is our chance. Toddy looked at her, saw the determination in her eyes, and understood she was right. Can you walk? She looked at her bandaged feet, then back at him. I'll have to, won't I? Mabel stood up, already understanding. My mule's tied behind the boarding house 2 buildings over. Old Bessie, she's slow but steady. Take her. Mabel, if Crowell finds out. Let him find out, Mabel said fiercely. I didn't speak up for Cora when I should have. I won't make that mistake twice. Go. Silas was already pulling together supplies, bandages, laudanum, dried beef, hard cheese bread. He shoved everything into a canvas sack and handed it to Toddy, along with a wool blanket. Devil's Elbow is about 12 miles northeast, old telegraph relay station. There's a telegraph key there that connects to the main line. If Klaus ran when the fire started, he might be heading there. If you can reach it, you can send a message to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. Get help from someone who doesn't owe Crowell. Toddy took the sack and looked at Arabella seriously. This will be hard. Dangerous. If we are caught, if we stay here, I become Crowell's property. She interrupted. I'll take dangerous over that. He nodded and took her hand, squeezing gently. Stay close to me. Step where I step. If I tell you to run, you run and do not look back. Understood. Understood. They slipped out the back door into the alley where shadows were deep and snow was accumulating. Behind them, Silver Spur erupted in chaos, men shouting about buckets and water, the roar of flames consuming dry timber, the frantic clanging of the fire bell. Mabel's mule was exactly where she said, tied behind the boarding house, gray, around the muzzle, but with calm, steady eyes. Toddy untied it and turned to help Arabella mount. She was trying to pull herself up, but could not manage with her wrapped feet. He placed his hands on her waist and lifted her onto the mule's back. She weighed almost nothing. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to grip the mule's mane, his body pressed against her back. His coat wrapped around both of them, and their breaths mingled in white clouds. Hold on, he said quietly, his voice close to her ear. And then they were moving the mule's hooves, making surprisingly little sound on snow-covered ground, picking their way between buildings and through the alley. They emerged at the edge of town, where buildings gave way to open prairie, and Toddy urged the mule faster, putting distance between themselves and Silver Spur as quickly as the old animal could manage. Behind them, the telegraph office burned like a signal fire, visible for miles. Ahead, the night was black and cold, and full of unknown dangers. But they were free. For now they were free. They had been riding perhaps 90 minutes when Toddy smelled it on the wind, faint but unmistakable. Coal oil, the kind used in lamps. Out here, miles from any homestead, he knew that smell meant people. He slowed the mule and turned to speak into Arabella's ear. "There is something ahead. A camp, maybe. I need to scout before we go closer. Can you wait here without making sound?" She nodded tensely. "Be careful." He slid down and helped her dismount, guiding her to a fallen log. She sat wrapping the blanket around her shoulders and watched as Toddy checked his knife and disappeared into the darkness. Arabella crouched behind the log, her heart hammering. The cold was brutal, seeping through every layer. She tried to count her breaths to stay calm, in for 4, out for 4. Minutes crawled past. 5. 10. She began imagining terrible scenarios Toddy discovered. Toddy shot Toddy's body bleeding in the snow while she sat here useless. Then she heard it. Voices, low and harsh, speaking in what sounded like German. Toddy reappeared like a ghost. He motioned for her to follow, and they moved through bare cottonwood trees with agonizing slowness. And then she saw it. A line camp. A small log cabin set back from the river, partially hidden by pines. Lamplight glowed in the window, smoke rose from the chimney. Outside, arranged in neat rows and covered with canvas tarps, were stacked wooden crates. But it was not the cabin or crates that made Arabella press her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. 2 women sat on the ground near the crates' wrists, bound with rough hemp rope. One was Lakota, maybe 18, with long black hair in 2 braids and a torn calico dress. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen. The other was white, younger, perhaps 15 or 16, with red hair hanging lank around her freckled face. She wore what had once been a traveling costume, now stained and torn. Both women's faces were blank with exhausted despair. 2 men stood guard. One was massive, built like a bull, with shoulders broad enough that he had to turn to fit through a doorway. He had thick features, a heavy brow, and pale eyes. He wore good quality wool clothing and new boots. In one hand, he held a leather-bound ledger. The second man was younger, dressed in typical ranch hand clothing, holding a rifle loosely. The big man, Bruno Kappel, flipped through the ledger as he spoke in accented English mixed with German. "These 2 go to the rail line at dawn. Foxy Kate already paid half $20 per head. The madam in Cheyenne will take them both, no questions. She prefers younger ones, easier to train." He glanced at the Lakota girl with dead eyes. "That one tried to bite me yesterday. Needed to be reminded of her place. A few days locked in the crib with no food makes them grateful to cooperate." The ranch hand shifted uncomfortably. "What about the third one, the girl from the stage? Crowell's keeping that one for himself. Legal marriage, all proper-like. Smart. Gives him cover. Hard to prosecute a man for kidnapping his own wife." Bruno's lips pulled back in something resembling a smile. "If this one works, we'll do it again. Plenty of desperate women back east. All we need is a name in the obituary column and a forged signature. Easier than grabbing them off the street, and it looks legal until someone digs deep. By then, the women are usually too broken or too scared to cause trouble." Toddy felt Arabella's body go rigid beside him. He placed his hand on her arm, a silent command to stay quiet. But he could feel her trembling, not with fear now, but with rage. This was not about her forged contract anymore. This was systematic. Crowell was running a pipeline capturing women from stage stops and rail terminals and funneling them to brothels across 3 territories. The proxy marriage scheme was one method among many. Kidnapping, debt bondage, outright purchase. And that ledger in Bruno's hand was the proof of all of it. Names, dates, prices, destinations, everything they needed to destroy Crowell's operation. Toddy counted the men 2 outside, probably at least 1 inside based on sounds of movement. 3 against 1, maybe 4, and he would have to protect Arabella and the captive women. The odds were terrible. But if they could get that ledger... He leaned close to Arabella and whispered directly into her ear, his lips nearly touching her skin. "I am going to cause a distraction. When I do, you run to those women and cut their bonds. Use this." He pressed his knife into her hand, folding her cold fingers around the bone handle. "Then all of you run back here to the mule. Do not wait for me. Just run. Do you understand?" She wanted to argue, but she understood there was no other choice. If they walked away now, those 2 women would be sold tomorrow, would disappear into brothels, would be broken and used until they died, just like Cora. She nodded, throat too tight to speak. He looked at her for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face as if memorizing it. Then he touched her cheek very briefly, the lightest brush of his fingertips against her skin, and was gone. What happened next unfolded with brutal efficiency. Toddy moved through darkness like a hunting cat. He picked up a heavy branch from the woodpile, thick as a man's wrist, solid oak, heavy enough to serve as a club. He judged the distance, judged the angle, and hurled it with all his strength through the cabin's single window. Glass exploded inward with a tremendous crash that shattered the quiet night. Shards sprayed across the cabin's interior, and someone inside shouted in alarm. Bruno spun around his hand, going to the revolver holstered at his hip, shouting in German, "Was zum Teufel?" And the ranch hand jerked his rifle up, searching for a target. In that moment of chaos, Toddy moved. He burst from the tree line, grabbing another piece of firewood as a makeshift club. He swung hard for Bruno's gun hand as the big man was bringing his revolver up. The wood connected with a solid thunk. Bruno's revolver went flying, spinning into the snow, and he roared with pain and rage. Toddy dropped the wood and lunged for the fallen gun, his fingers closing around the grip as Bruno's boot came down, stomping hard. Toddy rolled aside the boot, missing his hand by inches, and came up empty-handed. Bruno was on him instantly, using his superior size to drive Toddy backward into the cabin wall. The impact drove the air from Toddy's lungs, and he felt ribs crack, not break completely, but crack enough to send white-hot pain shooting through his chest. The ranch hand raised his rifle and fired. The shot was deafening, the muzzle flash bright. The bullet went wide, missing Toddy by a foot, but sending up splinters from the cabin wall. "Don't shoot, you fool!" Bruno shouted. "We need to question him first." Behind them, the cabin door crashed open, and another man stumbled out, half-dressed and holding a shotgun. Toddy saw him peripherally and knew the situation was deteriorating fast. So he kicked out the nearest lantern. The lantern flew from its hook and shattered against the ground, spilling burning oil across the snow and the cabin's dry timber walls. Flames licked up instantly, and suddenly there was chaos of a different kind. Fire spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. Bruno cursed and released Toddy to beat at the flames with his coat. The ranch hand dropped his rifle and ran for a bucket. The half-dressed man stood frozen, trying to decide whether to shoot or help with the fire. Toddy used that moment. He dove for the ledger which Bruno had dropped when the fight started. His fingers closed around the leather binding as Bruno realized what he was doing and lunged after him. But Arabella was already running. She had waited for Toddy's signal, had watched the chaos unfold, and now she sprinted toward the two bound women, with Toddy's knife clutched in her hand. Her bandaged feet screamed protest with every step, and she could feel fresh blood soaking through. But she did not stop. She reached the Lakota girl first. "I'm here to help," she gasped. "Hold still." The girl understood, or simply understood the intent. She held her bound wrists out, and Arabella sawed at the hemp rope with Toddy's knife. The blade was sharp, well-maintained, and the rope parted after a few seconds of frantic cutting. The Lakota girl, Winona, immediately grabbed the knife from Arabella's hands and turned to cut the younger girl's bonds. "Inagni," she hissed at the red-haired girl. "Kinyan." The younger girl, Mary, nodded frantically, tears streaming, and pulled her hands free once the rope loosened. "Run!" Arabella shouted, pointing toward the trees. "That way. There's a mule. Go." Bruno saw them. His face contorted with rage, and he abandoned the fire, drawing a knife from his belt, a big blade 10 inches at least. He charged toward Arabella with murder in his pale eyes. Toddy saw him coming. He still had the ledger clutched in one hand, and he knew he should run, should save the evidence. But he could not let Bruno reach Arabella. He threw himself into Bruno's path, and they collided with bone-jarring force. Both men went down hard, rolling in the snow, grappling for control of the knife. Bruno was bigger, stronger, but Toddy was faster. He got his hand on Bruno's wrist, forcing the knife away from his throat, and then drove his knee into Bruno's ribs. Bruno grunted, but did not release the knife. He headbutted Toddy, and Toddy's vision exploded with white stars. Blood poured from his nose, hot against his cold face. Behind them, the fire was spreading flames, climbing the cabin walls and beginning to eat at the roof supports. Black smoke billowed into the night sky. Arabella grabbed Winona and Mary, pushing them toward the trees. "Go run, I'll get him." But Winona shook her head. She bent and picked up the rifle the ranch hand had dropped, checking to see if it was loaded. It was. She brought it to her shoulder with practiced ease. "Drop it, or I drop you." The ranch hand froze, then slowly raised his hands. Toddy managed to twist Bruno's knife hand, forcing it up and away, and then slammed Bruno's wrist against a stone near the cabin foundation. Once, twice, 3 times. On the third impact, Bruno's grip loosened and the knife fell. Toddy grabbed it and rolled away, coming to his feet with Bruno's knife in one hand and the ledger clutched against his chest with the other. Bruno rose more slowly, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, his face a mask of animal rage. He reached for his boot, where Toddy now saw he had a second knife. But before Bruno could draw it, the cabin's roof began collapse with a groaning, cracking sound. Burning timbers crashed down and everyone scattered. "Go!" Toddy shouted to Arabella and the others. "Go now!" They ran. Arabella stumbled, but Winona caught her arm, supporting her weight, and Mary grabbed her other arm. Together, the 3 women ran for the trees, while Toddy covered their retreat, Bruno's knife ready. But the men were focused on the fire now, on not dying in a burning building. Bruno stood in the snow watching Toddy and the women disappear into the darkness, and his face was terrible. A promise of vengeance, of pursuit. Toddy turned and ran, his cracked ribs screaming, blood still pouring from his nose, but alive. He was alive, and so were the women, and he had the ledger. They reached the mule, and there was a brief scramble to get everyone mounted. The old animal was not designed to carry 4 people, but it would have to manage. Winona climbed on first, still holding the rifle, and helped pull Mary up behind her. Toddy lifted Arabella onto the mule's back in front of the others, and then swung up himself, the ledger shoved inside his shirt against his skin, Bruno's knife thrust through his belt. "Imninaye," he said to the mule, slapping its flank. And the mule hurried. It sensed the urgency and broke into a lurching canter, carrying its impossible burden across the frozen prairie toward Devil's Elbow. Behind them, the line camp burned orange flames, visible for miles against the black night. A beacon and a warning. Dawn was still hours away when they finally stopped. They had ridden hard, pushing the mule beyond reason, and the poor animal was heaving and stumbling. Toddy found a hollow between two low hills and called a halt. They all slid down, fell down really, and collapsed in the snow. For several minutes, no one spoke. They simply breathed lungs, burning bodies pushed past exhaustion into some strange territory where everything felt distant. Finally, Toddy forced himself to move. He examined the mule first, checking for injuries, running his hands along its legs. The animal was exhausted but sound. He took the blanket and rubbed the mule down, trying to keep it from getting too cold now that they had stopped. Then he turned to the women. Winona was sitting with her back against a rock, the rifle across her lap, her eyes scanning the horizon despite the darkness. She had the look of a survivor, someone who had learned to stay vigilant or die. Mary was curled in a ball, shaking with sobs, or cold, or both. She was young, too young for this nightmare. Arabella was examining her feet, and Toddy could see even from a distance that they were a disaster. The bandages were soaked through with blood. He approached her carefully, kneeling in the snow. "Let me see." She shook her head. "I'm fine. We need to keep moving. They'll come after us." "They will," he agreed, "but not for a few hours. They need to put out the fire and regroup, and this mule needs rest or it will die, and then we will all die. So let me see your feet." She hesitated, then nodded. He unwrapped the bandages, and his jaw tightened at what he saw. The blisters had burst, the cuts had reopened, and there were fresh abrasions from running. She needed a proper doctor rest healing time. She had none of those things. He pulled the bottle of laudanum from the canvas sack. "Please, this time please take it. You will not be able to walk without it, and we may need to walk before this is over." She took the bottle and drank a small sip, making a face at the bitter taste. "Thank you." He cleaned her feet as best he could with snow and strips of cloth torn from the blanket, then rewrapped them. It was inadequate, but it would have to do. Winona spoke first, her English accented, but clear. "Where do we go now?" "There is an old telegraph station northeast of here," Toddy said. "Devil's Elbow, maybe 12 miles. If we can reach it, we can send word to the territorial marshal. Get help. And if Bruno catches us first." Toddy met her eyes steadily. "Then we fight, and we do not lose, because losing means death, or worse for all of us." She nodded, accepting this. "I am Winona. This is Mary. Who are you, Toddy? And this is Arabella." "Thank you for coming for us," Winona said quietly. "Do not thank me yet," Toddy said. "We are not safe, but we are alive, and that is something." They rested for perhaps 45 minutes, huddling together for warmth, sharing the food Silas had packed. The dried beef and hard cheese felt like a feast. Then they heard it. Distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast. "Damnedest thing," Toddy breathed. "They are coming faster than I expected." "Because of the ledger," Arabella said, understanding dawning. "That ledger is evidence that could hang Crowell and Bruno both. They can't afford to let us keep it. They'll risk everything to get it back." "Then we need to move," Winona said, already standing. They mounted the mule again, 4 people on one exhausted animal, fleeing into the darkness ahead of pursuit that would not stop. They reached Devil's Elbow as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. The telegraph relay station was exactly what Silas had described, barely more than a shack, 4 walls, and a sagging roof with a single wire running through it. But there was smoke coming from the chimney and lamplight in the window. Someone was there. Toddy approached cautiously, knife-ready, positioning himself between the women and whatever threat might be inside. But before he could knock, the door opened to reveal Klaus Bittner. Klaus looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. His face was haggard, his clothes singed and covered in soot, his hands shaking. "Thank thunder you made it," he said hoarsely. "I've been sending messages since I got here 2 hours ago. The territorial marshal in Cheyenne, the circuit judge, even the federal marshal in Denver. I told them everything: Crowell's operation, the trafficking, the forged contracts." "Did anyone respond?" Arabella asked, hope rising. "The marshal in Cheyenne did. He said he's sending men, but it'll take time. At least 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather turns. He said to stay put and stay safe." Klaus laughed without humor. Safe. As if anywhere is safe now. Toddy pulled the ledger from inside his shirt and handed it to Klaus. "Send information from this. Names, dates, destinations. Make it impossible for Crowell to claim ignorance." Klaus took the ledger with reverent care, as if it were a holy relic. He opened it and began reading, his face growing paler with each page. "Sweet, merciful, this goes back 5 years. There are dozens of names here." "Send it all," Arabella said fiercely. "Every name, every date, every detail. Make sure the world knows what he did." Klaus nodded and sat down at the telegraph key. His fingers began to move, tapping out messages that reduced human suffering to dots and dashes transmitted across copper wire. Toddy positioned himself at the window, watching the prairie. The sun was rising now, painting the snow pink and gold. And in that growing light, he could see them. Riders, at least 7 or 8, spread in a line, moving methodically toward Devil's Elbow. And at the head rode Bruno Kappel, his face a mask of cold determination. "They are coming," Toddy said quietly. "They will be here in less than 10 minutes. Klaus's fingers moved faster. Crowell operation confirmed. Stop ledger recovered with names and dates. Stop need immediate assistance. Devil's Elbow station. Stop under threat. Stop. Arabella moved to stand beside Toddy. "What do we do?" "We hold them off," Toddy said simply. "We have 1 rifle, 1 knife, and this shack. We make them work for it. And we keep Klaus alive long enough to finish sending those messages." Winona checked the rifle, counting ammunition. 6 rounds. Maybe 7 if there's 1 in the chamber. Not enough. "Then we make every shot count." The riders were closer now. Bruno led them, and beside him rode Sheriff Orville Pike. Arabella's heart sank. The sheriff is with them. He's formed a legal posse. "Then they will announce themselves and demand we surrender," Toddy said. "And we will refuse." "Toddy, if it's a legal posse—" "It is not legal," he interrupted. "A legal posse would wait for the judge, would review evidence properly. This is Bruno using Crowell's influence to turn the law into a weapon. I will not surrender to it. Will you?" She looked at him, at his battered face and determined eyes. "No, I will not." Klaus kept typing. "Bruno Kappel leading posse, stop request, immediate federal intervention, stop please, advise stop." The response came almost immediately. "Hold position, stop help coming, stop 2 days, maximum stop, do not surrender, ledger stop." 2 days. They had to hold out for 2 days against Bruno and 8 armed men. In a shack with no food, no water source, and only 6 bullets. The odds were impossible. Outside, Bruno's voice rang out. "Toddy, send out the women and the ledger, and you can walk away. You have my word. Toddy did not respond. Bruno's word was worthless. This is your last chance. We have you surrounded. Be smart about this. Still, Toddy said nothing. All right then. Bruno said, his voice flat and cold. You made your choice. Break it down. The assault on Devil's Elbow began with brutal efficiency. 2 of Bruno's men picked up a section of broken fence post and used it as a battering ram. The door shuddered violently with the first impact. Splinters flew from the frame. Toddy braced his shoulder against the door, his boots digging into the dirt floor. The second impact nearly knocked him off his feet, driving him back 2 inches. His cracked ribs screamed protest, but he held. Klaus, Arabella said urgently. How much longer? 2 minutes, maybe 3. I need to finish sending the names. We don't have 3 minutes, Winona said. She had positioned herself in the corner where she had the best angle, the rifle at her shoulder. A third impact and the door began to splinter. Toddy could see daylight through the cracks. Winona fired. The sound inside the small shack was deafening, a physical blow that left everyone's ears ringing. The bullet punched through the door, and they heard a scream from outside, not a death scream, but pain. One of the men using the battering ram had taken a round in the shoulder. That's one, Winona said, working the rifle's bolt. 5 left. Klaus's fingers flew across the key, sending names into the ether. Me Cora Bennett. Stop Mary Tolliver. Stop Winona Blackhorse. Stop. On and on the names of the dead and the victimized. A gunshot from outside, and a bullet punched through the wall near Arabella's head, showering her with splinters. She yelped and dove to the floor. Get down, Toddy shouted. Away from the walls. They were shooting blind through the walls now. Another shot, another bullet tearing through the thin wood, and then another. Mary was curled in the corner hands, over her ears sobbing. Arabella crawled to her and pulled the girl close, shielding her body with her own. The door splintered further. One more solid hit and it would give way. Ready, Arabella said. And she realized she was holding Klaus's Remington revolver, the same one she had fired at the line camp. Her hands were steadier now. Ready? Toddy echoed, shifting his grip on the knife. The fence post punched through, smashing a hole the size of a man's head. Through the gap, Arabella could see men crowding forward, could smell gun smoke and unwashed bodies and blood. Winona fired again, shooting through the hole. Another scream, and someone cursed viciously. 2, Winona said. 4 rounds left. Klaus kept typing, sweat running down his temples despite the cold. Evidence complete. Stop. Full ledger transmitted. Stop. Advise. Next step. Stop. The response came back. Barricade. Stop. Defend position. Stop. Help coming. Stop. Very helpful, Klaus muttered. The door exploded inward as the fence post finally broke through the hinges. Men poured in. Bruno at the front, his face twisted with rage, a revolver in each hand. Toddy met him head-on, moving inside the reach of the guns before Bruno could aim properly. His knife flashed, catching Bruno across the forearm, and one of the revolvers clattered to the floor. But Bruno's fist caught Toddy in the ribs, right where they were already cracked, and Toddy's vision went white with pain. Winona fired, and a man went down. 3 rounds left. Arabella raised the Remington and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted her wrists, but she stayed steady. Her shot caught one of Bruno's men in the thigh, and he stumbled, falling against the wall. Bruno backhanded Toddy, sending him crashing into the table where Klaus was working. The telegraph key flew off and hit the floor wires, ripping loose. No! Klaus dove for the key, trying desperately to reconnect it. Bruno leveled his remaining revolver at Toddy's head. Should have taken my offer. A shot rang out, but it did not come from inside the shack. Bruno jerked his aim, going wild, his bullet burying itself in the wall. He looked down at his chest, where blood was spreading, and then looked up at the door in confusion. Sheriff Orville Pike stood in the doorway, his shotgun still smoking his face, set in grim lines. "That's enough, Bruno," Orville said quietly. "It's over." What happened in the next few minutes would be debated in Silver Spur for years, but certain facts were undeniable. Orville Pike, despite being Crowell's brother-in-law, and despite having ridden with Bruno's posse, had reached a point where he could not ignore his conscience any longer. He had spent the ride to Devil's Elbow listening to Bruno and the other men discuss shooting everyone inside and burning the shack to destroy evidence. Had realized he was riding with murderers, not lawmen. His wife Sarah's tears had haunted him. Cora Bennett's grave haunted him. And the look in Arabella Ward's eyes when she had begged for his help haunted him most of all. So when Bruno raised his gun to shoot an unarmed man in cold blood, Orville made a choice, perhaps the first truly good choice he had made in years. He shot Bruno Capel through the chest, the heavy load of buckshot at close range nearly cutting the big man in half. Bruno fell without another sound, dead before he hit the ground. The other men in the posse froze, uncertain. "Drop your weapons," Orville said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "All of you. Right now." One by one, they complied. Revolvers and rifles clattered to the floor. Orville looked at Toddy, at Arabella, at the other women. "Are any of you hurt badly?" "We'll live," Toddy said, though his ribs felt like broken glass, and his face was a mask of blood and bruises. "Good." Orville turned to the men who had been riding with Bruno. "You boys are going to ride back to Silver Spur, and you're going to tell Fitzgerald Crowell that his operation is finished. Tell him the ledger has been transmitted to the Territorial Marshal in Cheyenne. Tell him I'm bringing formal charges of trafficking, kidnapping, fraud, and murder. Tell him if he runs, I'll chase him to the ends of the earth." One of the men, a young ranch hand, spoke hesitantly. "Sheriff Crowell ain't gonna like." "I don't give a twisted damn what Crowell likes," Orville interrupted. "I've been looking the other way for too long. No more. Now go." They went mounting their horses and riding back toward Silver Spur at a gallop. Orville knelt beside Bruno's body, checking for a pulse, even though it was pointless. Finding none, he straightened and looked at the mess the shack had become: bullet holes, blood, the telegraph key lying broken. Klaus was on his knees, trying to reconnect the wires. "I need to send confirmation that the transmission was complete." "Klaus," Orville said gently, "it's done. You did it. The messages got through. I saw the responses. Help is coming." Klaus sagged. "It's done. We actually did it." Arabella started to laugh, a sound half hysterical and half relieved. "We're alive. By some miracle, we're actually alive." Toddy smiled despite the pain. "We are." Winona set down the rifle carefully and went to Mary, pulling the younger girl into a fierce embrace. They had survived. Orville looked at them all, this unlikely group of survivors who had brought down an empire built on suffering, and felt something ease in his chest, some weight lifting. "We should get you all back to town," he said. "Doc Boone needs to look at those injuries, and you need food and rest. The marshal will be here in a few days to take statements and make arrests, but until then, you're under my protection. Anyone who tries to harm you will answer to me." Arabella looked at Toddy. "Can we trust him?" Toddy studied Orville, then nodded slowly. "We trust you, Sheriff. Thank you for making the right choice." "Should have made it sooner," Orville said quietly. "A lot sooner, but better late than never." They gathered what little they had and prepared to leave Devil's Elbow behind. As they stepped out into the morning sunlight, Arabella realized something that made her laugh again, this time with pure joy. It was over. The nightmare was finally truly over. She was free. The territorial marshal arrived from Cheyenne 2 days later, with 4 deputies and a wagon with iron shackles. He wasted no time in arresting Fitzgerald Crowell. Crowell tried to run. He made it as far as the stage road to Prairie Rose before Orville, and the marshal's men caught up with him. When they searched his saddlebags, they found $3,000 in banknotes, a forged passport for fleeing abroad. No passport was needed for domestic travel in the U.S., and a ticket for passage to San Francisco. Instead, he was brought back to Silver Spur in chains, and the whole town turned out to watch. Some threw vegetables and mud. Others simply stood silent, bearing witness. The trial was held 6 weeks later. Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence the ledger Klaus had transmitted, along with testimony from Arabella, Winona, Mary Mabel, Klaus, Foxy Kate, and a dozen other witnesses who had seen pieces of Crowell's operation over the years. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict took the jury less than an hour. Guilty on 17 counts of trafficking, 23 counts of fraud, 12 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder for his role in Cora Bennett's death. Crowell was sentenced to hang, but the sentence was later commuted to life in the territorial prison. He died there 8 years later of pneumonia, alone and forgotten. Spring came slowly to the prairie, but when it finally arrived, it felt like a promise being kept. The snow melted, the grass turned green, and White Fork River ran clear and cold, free of illegal barbed wire fences removed by court order. Arabella found a small cabin near Mabel's schoolhouse and began teaching penmanship, arithmetic, and reading to the children of homesteaders and Lakota families alike. But her work did not stop at teaching. She also worked with Silas Boone and the Territorial Marshal's Office, compiling comprehensive lists of missing women from rail towns and stage stops across 3 territories. Some of the women were found alive and brought home. Others were confirmed dead and their families finally receiving closure. Not all were found, but the ones who were that mattered. Winona returned to her band's allotment land, but visited Silver Spur regularly. She became an advocate for her people, working with the territorial government to ensure treaties were honored and Lakota families received the resources they had been promised. Mary was adopted by Mabel and moved into her small house. The girl would wake screaming from nightmares for months, but slowly, with patience and care, she began to heal. She eventually became a teacher herself. Klaus kept his job at the telegraph office, but now he refused to send any message without proper documentation. He became known as the most scrupulously honest telegraph operator in the territory. Sheriff Orville Pike resigned his badge before the next election, convinced he had failed. But when Election Day came, the townspeople voted him back into office by a wide margin. He had made terrible mistakes, but he had also made the right choice when it mattered most. And Toddy visited Silver Spur every week without fail. Sometimes he would stop by the schoolhouse, and Arabella would walk with him to the river where the ice had broken and the water ran clear. They would talk about small things, weather crops, the children's progress. Sometimes they would not talk at all, just stand together in comfortable silence and watch the water flow. One evening in late May, Toddy found Arabella caught in a sudden rainstorm. She was walking back from visiting a homesteader family when the rain came down in sheets. Toddy appeared seemingly from nowhere, though in truth he had been waiting near the schoolhouse, as he often did, and silently he positioned himself windward, his body blocking the worst of the rain. His blanket draped over her shoulders, his hand steady and warm on her shoulder, until the worst of the storm passed. They stood like that for perhaps 10 minutes, not speaking, just breathing in rhythm. When the rain finally eased, Arabella turned to look up at him. "I don't want you to leave," she said quietly. "Not tonight. Not ever. I want you to stay." I want to stay, he said. I have wanted to stay for a long time. Then why haven't you? Because I wanted to be certain you were choosing me, not choosing gratitude. I wanted you to be free, truly free, with choices that belonged to you before I asked you to choose me. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the scar on his cheekbone. I am choosing you. Not out of gratitude, though, I am grateful. Not out of obligation. I'm choosing you because you are brave and kind, and you treat me like I matter. Because when I'm with you, I feel like the person I always wanted to be. Because I love you. Tati smiled, and it transformed his face. I love you too. Chantechiuja, you hold my heart. He leaned down and kissed her, gentle and careful. The rain fell around them, and the prairie stretched out in all directions, and it was absolutely perfect. They did not marry immediately. By frontier standards, they took things scandalously slow, courting properly for nearly a year. Toddy building a small house near White Fork River on land he had claimed under the Homestead Act. When they finally did marry, it was in a ceremony that blended traditions. A minister spoke Christian vows, and then a Lakota elder spoke blessings in Lakota and tied their hands together with a woven cord. Mabel stood as Arabella's witnessed tears streaming down her face. Winona sang a Lakota wedding song. Sheriff Orville and his wife Sarah attended, bringing a quilt Sarah had made. Klaus gave them teacups ordered from Cheyenne. Silas gave them medical supplies and good advice. And standing in the back wearing a simple dress and holding Mabel's hand was Mary, smiling for the first time in months. After the ceremony, there was celebration, food, music, dancing, laughter. As the sun set, Arabella and Toddy slipped away to begin their ride to the little house by White Fork River. They rode together on Toddy's bay mare. The prairie stretched out around them in the dying light, vast and beautiful and dangerous and free. Just like them. Years passed. Silver Spur grew into a proper town with a railroad depot and a brick courthouse. The schoolhouse was expanded, rebuilt, enlarged again. Mabel eventually retired and devoted herself to suffrage work. Klaus married a widow and had 2 children. Orville served as sheriff for another 20 years. Winona married and had 5 children, never stopping her fight for her people's rights. Mary became a teacher and eventually the principal of Silver Spur's school. And Arabella and Toddy lived in the house by White Fork River for the rest of their lives. They had 3 children, 2 daughters, and a son, and raised them bilingual in English and Lakota, bicultural, fiercely protective of justice and equality. Their home became a stopping point for Lakota families, traveling, a place where travelers knew they would find a meal and a place to sleep with no questions asked. Arabella continued teaching until she was 70, finally retiring when her hands became too arthritic to write. By then, she had taught 3 generations of children. Toddy worked as a translator and advocate, helping Lakota families navigate the legal system. He also served on the town council for 15 years, and the first Native American to hold that position. They grew old together, their hair turning gray and then white, their hands becoming gnarled, but their love remained steady and sure, built on mutual respect and shared purpose that no amount of time could erode. Late in their lives, a young journalist from Denver came to interview them about the Crowell case. "What do you want people to remember?" he asked. Arabella and Toddy looked at each other with the wordless communication that came from 50 years of partnership. And then Arabella spoke. "Remember that evil prospers when good people stay silent. Remember that laws can be weapons or shields depending on who wields them. Remember that the most important word in any language is no. No, you cannot treat me this way. No, I will not allow this injustice. No, I will not surrender my humanity or anyone else's." Toddy added, "Remember that change begins with one person deciding to act, even when the odds are terrible. Remember that standing up for what is right often costs something. But the cost of staying silent is always higher. And remember that we all have a choice every day between being part of the problem or part of the solution. After the journalist left Arabella and Toddy sat together on the porch watching the sunset over White Fork River. "Do you have any regrets?" Arabella asked quietly. Toddy considered seriously. "I regret that we could not save everyone. That some women died before we could stop Crowell. That it took so long for people to act. But do you regret helping me?" He turned to look at her, and his eyes were still dark and clear and full of certainty. "Never," he said simply. "Not for one moment have I regretted that choice. It gave me you. It gave me our life together. How could I possibly regret that?" She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his the way she had that first night at White Fork River when they were running for their lives. His hand was warm and familiar, scarred and weathered, but still strong, still steady. "I love you," she said. "Chanta chiuja." "I love you too," he said. "Always." They sat together as the stars came out as they had thousands of times before, and they were content. Arabella died in her sleep at age 82, peacefully with Toddy holding her hand. She had lived to see her grandchildren grown, had lived to see the 20th century arrive, had lived to see women gain the right to vote. She had lived a full life, a meaningful life, a life that mattered. Toddy followed her 6 months later. The doctor said it was his heart, but everyone who knew him understood it was more than that. It was grief, yes, but also completion. He had fought the good fight, had protected those who needed protecting, had loved deeply and been loved in return. There was nothing left that required him to stay. They were buried side by side in the Silver Spur Cemetery under a cottonwood tree. Their headstone was simple: Arabella Ward, 1859-1941. Teacher, advocate, beloved, Toddy Blackhorse, 1853-1941. Warrior, protector, beloved, Iuha, Wichasha, Ikche Wichasha, all people are equal. Every year on the anniversary of the day, Arabella stepped off that stagecoach, and Toddy first said, "You don't own her." The school children of Silver Spur would visit the grave and place flowers. And they would recite the story they had learned in their history classes, the story of how ordinary people had stood up against evil and won, had risked everything for justice, and freedom had changed the world by refusing to accept the world as it was. The story had become legend, but unlike most legends, this one had the advantage of being true. And in that truth lay a lesson that echoed across generations: no one should own another person. Not through law, not through force, not through fear. That truth had to be defended constantly, vigilantly, courageously, or it would be lost. The children learned that lesson well, and they carried it forward into a future that their grandparents had died to make possible.